thought it would be in this last year. One thing that we have tried to do is to encourage creativity, be a little creative with our pivots and our response to the, where we are with climate action. One of the latest things we have is a new art display in front of our office where some mostly college, but also high school students created art and a little audio guide that goes along with that, sort of an artist statements. And it's all in a new display that we hope to bring different arts into, these are visual arts, into how we respond and think about. We know that it's more than just words that we need, or more than just facts and presentations. We need a creative response. With that, I'm going to toss it to Caroline for just a quick minute here.
Yeah, so thanks, Amy. Just, we've all created our own coping mechanisms during Zoom meetings. One of mine is doodling. And because we're also trying to bring more art into this discussion, we encourage all of you to go ahead and draw, color, collage, whatever suits your fancy. I've got my colored pencils and my notebook. I'm just going to take some visual notes as we have this conversation today. And at the end of it, if you feel comfortable sharing, we can all hold it up in our Zoom squares, or you can email it to us later and we'll share with everyone. But we encourage you to get a little creative, and everything is in bounds for it. So thank you.
Yes, words, visual, and if not tonight, that's truly what we need to bring to this, and we'll speak to that. Okay. Again, okay, let's see where we are. Dr. Rob Davies, quickly, in case you, maybe missed our last show or don't quite remember, Dr. Davies is a physicist and a noted science communicator whose work focuses on complexity, global climate change, and human vibrancy. He is an associate professor at Utah State University's Department of Physics, and he's joining us today from Logan, Utah. So we'll hand it off to Rob. And again, as ideas come up and questions come up for Rob, please just pop them in the chat. It's all yours, Rob.
Well, thanks so much, Amy, for the invitation and for the idea for this. And I love the idea, Caroline, of, and Caroline for this idea, but this notion of doodling and just sort of taking notes in creative ways. Like most scientists, I've been to many, many, many meetings. And a few years ago, I started taking notes in a notebook in a different way. It used to be just very linear, sort of you put the title up the top and you just start taking notes. And I realized I was never really going back and looking at these things. So I started in the same notebook, just putting the name of the meeting right in the middle of the page and circling it and drawing little arrows off to everything and little doodles. And now as a result, I actually look at those notes every now and then. I'm kind of entertained anyway. So it's a great idea. And somehow it changes the way I think about it too, when I take them. Well, so again, thanks for the invitation. I just think it's maybe worth pointing out that the talk I gave in Missoula at the Wilma last year as part of your event was the very last public lecture I gave. It was also the highlight of a tour of lectures that took place in the fall of 2019 and the early winter of 2020. And this included going to some great places, lots of great audiences, lots of great organizers in those communities. This was in Salt Lake City and Park City, Steamboat Springs, Vail, Breckenridge, Jackson, Bozeman. But even in that company, Missoula was extra special. It was just my absolute favorite event last year. The whole atmosphere in the Wilma was just wonderful and vibrant, and it was just great to be a part of it. And I'm looking forward to hearing Gwen at the end of today's talk, because I quite enjoyed her introduction to the event last year. So Missoula was extra special, and it was my last talk. So again, a real treat to be speaking with you guys again. I thought what I would do is, Amy asked me to just maybe recap briefly the talk and then kind of talk about this past year. So let's start with what we talked about last year. And the point of last year's talk actually certainly was climate change, but it was more that climate change is one piece of a larger puzzle in a full suite of these ecological and social crises that we're facing that all have the same underlying pathology. Um, and in addition to climate change, for example, there's this biodiversity crisis. We've lost nearly 70% of the world's creatures by population over the last 40 years. The extinction rate is 1,000 times over where it should be, the natural background extinction rate. We also have a sustainability crisis within our human systems. We currently need 1.7 planets worth of resources to sustain our current level of consumption. And we can expect the wheels to be pretty much fully off this cart without meaningful change in as little as in no more really than 3 decades. And we're also facing a crisis of inequity and human deprivation. 24 people, more or less, control half the world's wealth. 24 people control half the world's wealth. And about 3 billion people live in some form of critical human deprivation. And we can now add to this suite of crises a radicalization crisis, I would say, certainly within our own society. And in this case, a radicalization, which being the bad kind, not the good kind. We also talked last year about a response needed to address all of this holistically. The point was that all of these crises are inextricably interconnected, and it makes the problem bigger, but it also has a feature of making it tractable. Part of the reason we've been unable to make progress on these crises is because we keep trying to address them in isolation. And when we realize they're connected, it opens doors for a response that we didn't realize were there. And so we can do the right thing on one front, climate change, for example, and hope that that can, done well, synergistically aid on other fronts. We also talked about how ours is not principally a technological challenge that we face in addressing these crises. Certainly there are technological issues to be overcome, but principally this is not a technological challenge, it's a cultural challenge. And we need to look no further to make that plausible than to say, what good is PPE and vaccines if we can't get ourselves as a society to use them? Okay. And then finally, last time we ended our talk with mindset, and Amy, you just touched on that. We talked about a need for a mindset from which genuinely meaningful response can emerge. And that mindset is an emergency mindset. And within that mindset, we talked about the inadequacy of this hope-despair framework. And instead, the need for resolve. And the notion was we don't necessarily see the path to the top of the mountain, but we see next steps, and that our task is to identify and take next steps. And that then is what we talked about 1 year ago in Missoula. And since then, what's happened? Well, not much, actually, right? Just a global pandemic, 2.5 million global deaths, 20% of those here in the United States, an economic meltdown, mass unemployment, centuries of social and racial injustice boiling over yet again, an election, an insurrection, and mass radicalization of our fellow citizens. So in terms of ecological and social indicators, just about nothing has gotten better. And I will make the exception here in the United States, one bright spot being, of course, the results of this election back in November, which is unquestionably a bright spot. And I think many of us on this call, hopefully I'm not making too big of an assumption, but certainly me was holding on to. And it certainly didn't come without a cost, but a bright spot nevertheless. That said, that's kind of a harsh thing to say. Over the course of the last year, essentially nothing has gotten better. In fact, most things have gotten worse. It's important to note that as we try to make progress, as we will make progress on these issues, it's not going to come evenly. It's going to come in fits and starts. And oftentimes we're not going to know the results of our efforts until we're able to look backwards and see them in the rearview mirror. And so, of course, our task, as I mentioned before, I firmly believe, and I live this way, is to keep our eyes on the prize and keep identifying next steps and taking them. Now, this past year, though, Caroline mentioned some in my discussion with Eva Rock from the university just a few minutes ago, Eva, you mentioned some COVID silver linings. And of course, I know what you mean by that. I think we all do. Given that there's been some pretty tremendous human suffering associated with this, we all know what we mean. We're not taking that term lightly. But this past year, largely as a result of COVID, has brought some things into pretty stark relief that needed to be brought into relief. And I would say the first one is this line that I often use, which is the need for us to believe what we know. So our system of knowledge and our system of information of science has told us what is happening to the planet and why. But part of the problem, of course, culturally, is we refuse to believe what we know. And I don't just mean the standard climate change denialists. I mean those of us who get that we have these problems, but are still not behaving like we have them. That's what I mean by not believing what we know. There's another piece to that, though, too, and that is not remembering what we've forgotten. Where science and technology can tell us all about how our world operates, it's this long history of culture, much of it indigenous culture, that taught us how to live on this planet, much of which we've forgotten, some of which as a result of our science and technology. And I feel like this last year has brought those things that we've forgotten and those people among us who still remember them to higher prominence. And I'm very grateful for that. This last year has taught us about our genuine ability to turn on a dime when we actually need to. I'm sure I'm not the first person to notice this, but if we all think back to last March and how quickly things shut down and how quickly we started to rearrange our lives, quite radically, as a result of meeting an emergency. So an emergency mindset kicked in and some very big steps were taken. Unfortunately, this last year has also shown us the critical role of leadership. And even when you had a society that you were able to turn and initially get on board with taking big steps to meet a challenge, if there's no follow through within the society, if there's no follow through within the leadership, if there's no coherent leadership at all levels, from federal to state to local, then those efforts largely go to waste in the end. We lost all kinds of time in our initial shutdown and all kinds of benefit that we could have had because the leadership wasn't there. And it shows us what happens when we don't heed objective reality and genuine knowledge as a result as well. Now, one thing that's happened in this last year that I still marvel at how long it's taken me to understand this. But a key piece of the puzzle that was revealed was the fundamentally broken information feedback loops in our society. As someone who's been working on climate change for nearly 2 decades, of course, I've understood the notion of misinformation and disinformation in climate change. But I just hadn't realized how pervasive it was throughout our entire society. We now have in complex systems, we need information to flow accurately. And when that information flow gets corrupted, the ability of a complex society to operate and correct itself goes away. And we now have tens of millions of people in our society that have been essentially brainwashed and radicalized. And I don't use those terms lightly, but so brainwashed and so radicalized as to make them functionally incompetent citizens. I've used the term functionally insane, but I want to be careful about that because I don't mean to stigmatize genuine mental illness. But this is, in fact, has rendered tens of millions of our fellow citizens incompetent, utterly untethered from reality and making decisions based purely on a delusional worldview, which is almost impenetrable. And this has arisen from a whole interconnection of information systems in our society, from cable news to talk radio to social media. We all know some aspect of this. And so it's clear that we must add to our already fairly lengthy to-do list a deprogramming of the radicalized and a shutting down of the pipeline that continues to produce such affected citizens and neighbors. Okay, well, that wasn't too promising, but there is some very good news. And let me say this. The Biden administration is embracing wholeheartedly a whole systems approach to our predicament. Now, early on in the election primary process last year, I was not a big fan of the Biden candidacy. I've always liked Joe Biden quite a lot. I think he's a genuinely good person. I just didn't think he was the man for the time. And I've completely changed my mind on that. I think he's now almost exactly the perfect person for the time. And one of the things that's changed my mind is it's clear that he sat down with the big thinkers in climate and in systems and in social crises, the ones who think about it holistically, and he's taking what they've said to heart. His climate and economic recovery plan is essentially the Green New Deal. He's not calling it that, and I think there's a good reason for that politically, but that's essentially what it is. It's putting human well-being and social justice at the very center of our approach, of a holistic approach to these crises, these social crises and these ecological crises, and that is very good news. And there's more good news. And that is because of how interconnected these things are, whoever you are and whatever your talents and whatever your means and whatever your interests, there is work for you to do. So whichever single thing you're working on, if it's social justice, if it's economics, if it's education, health, immigration, climate change, political reform, journalism reform, public policy, social media, voter rights, food, energy, whatever you're working on climate. And you're working on climate in particular if you understand how it's connected to those things. And of course, that's part of what last year's talk in Missoula was all about, was starting to better understand our connections. Of course, we only have a very short window for meaningful response, as we talked about last time. And so I would argue this right now. We need to be very busy right now. We need to be so busy right now. I think a lot of people are exhausted in the wake of the election. I think many, many people were extremely active in getting the current administration in, the previous disastrous administration out. And then it continued, right, for another 2 months in trying to get the Senate races won in Georgia. So those people who are utterly exhausted, you need to take a rest. And the rest of us who were less active in the drive up to the election, we now need to take over and take the front and take the vanguard and be working on every possible level, from the federal to the state to the local. Pick one. Don't have to work on them all. But those of us who have the energy and the time and the capacity need to be doing that with everything we've got. We've got so little time. If you're looking for some specific things to work on, I have a laundry list that's pretty short of absolutely critical right now. We need the filibuster gone. We need a national popular vote. And we need to have Joe Biden's climate and economic recovery plan enacted. It's a version of the Green New Deal, and it needs to be the law of the land. And I sound like a political consultant right now. I'm not even a member of a political party, but I'm astute enough, not very astute, but astute enough to recognize that the fight for big, meaningful systems change right now is happening right here in the United States, and it's happening at that level. We've got to do everything we can to support it. I want to say one more thing, though, about all of us being busy, and that is recognizing that all of us have different capacities at different times in our lives. I'm not trying to make this a contest. We do what we can, but we have to do that. We have to do what we can. Some of us at this moment in time have higher capacities, some less. And I think we need to respect that about each other as well. I'll make one more plug for a laundry list, and that is, if you don't want to work at the national or even international or state level, and I understand that things have gotten a little difficult at the state level in Montana, the local level is hugely important. And of course, Missoula has got a lot of energy in it. And I'll mention one program. It's called the City Portraits Thriving Cities Initiative. One of the drivers of it is a wonderful thinker named Kate Rayworth, who's been working on rethinking economics. A number of cities are adopting this framework, and I'll leave some resources. In fact, maybe I think I already gave them to Amy. It's a way of reformulating the way a city is structured and how that structure is put together to achieve real human well-being, looking at it from a local and a global lens, and also looking at it through a social and an ecological lens? How can you create your community such that the people in the community are placed, their well-being at the center of it, and the local ecology is placed at the center of it? But also create your community so that the people globally that are tied through all kinds of supply chains to your community are also being treated humanely. And the global ecological systems are also being treated fairly and well by what your city does. And this has to do with supply chains and products and all of those things flowing into and out of a city. So there's lots to be done even at the very local level. And this is critically important because if we think of our communities as laboratories for figuring out how to reinvent the way that we conduct ourselves on this planet, which has to be done, as all of these experiments take place in different communities around the world, the ones that are working bubble up and the ones that aren't can adapt and adjust. And so it's so important to have people involved at the community level, restructuring their community through this lens of people and ecology and local and global. So that's my comments, I guess, Amy and Caroline. Thanks so much for the invitation. And it's been a year. It's been a year. And now I'm actually really quite interested to hear about what's happening here in Missoula.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. We are getting folks having some comments and questions. And again, the way we'll do this is to put your questions into the chat, and our Climate Smart team will kind of merge and put together those. So Rob, you don't have to read the chat. That's always a little disorienting if you're trying to speak.
All right, great.
At the same time, we'll provide you some. But yeah, we appreciate your perspective. It is interesting that the physicist and the scientist doesn't have a lot of science to offer at this time. But I think those are the times we are in. So we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can, again, trying to pull some of them together. I was thinking, we rewatched last year and then we were kind of thinking about this. And so one question I'm just going to throw out there comes from your last statement. And that is, thinking of Kate Rayworth and that donut economics. Do you have some of the things I've already heard from people is, well, who else is doing that? What city is in a great example? Do you have a couple other localities where you really feel like that is working, that it's bubbling up, a city as a lab is bubbling up for as an example?
So I know that Amsterdam has actually fully embraced this approach. And there's some pretty interesting videos online and essays online talking about how it's going in Amsterdam. And it's quite fascinating and it's quite promising. They're learning an awful lot. And so part of it is just creating a city portrait, figuring out what your city is already working on and how this way of viewing it can be used to help with that. And in Amsterdam, for example, the example is a housing crisis, which is of course not unique. Many, many places in the world are experiencing some level of housing crisis, but they've completely upended the way they're approaching this housing crisis. And they seem to be pretty excited about it. So that's one example. And I don't have any others off the top of my head.
Okay, a few people have been offering some into the chat. Philadelphia, I know Portland has some donut economic principles. So I think that's good for our community. We're always looking for new ideas, but also to not necessarily have to recreate the wheel, look for what's working in other places. Another question that has come up, and again, we're going to try to keep pulling these together, but as a climate communicator, and again, we've been thinking about this since you were so eloquent both a year ago and here today, you obviously think a lot about how to convey your message, choosing your words very carefully, and we know that language matters. So do you have any advice for thinking about how to be bold and courageous in the ways we communicate the urgency of the climate crisis, but at the same time without alienating potential allies, while welcoming others into this movement? How do you balance that, or how do you just do that? Any advice?
So I do have a couple of thoughts on that. As I don't actually try to communicate to every possible audience. So I personally have focused my efforts on audiences that are, for lack of a better word, more sympathetic. In other words, people who more or less get that we have these problems, but typically often don't understand the scale and the urgency of the problems. I feel like I'm most effective with that crowd. And that's after 15 years of doing this and having many, many, many useless bad faith conversations, right? That said, there are people who are communicating in communities, and a community could be Missoula, but a community could be, say, a ranching community, or the community of engineers, or the community of bankers, that make inroads in, I think, are able to speak and get through to folks that maybe I'm not so compelling to. So I think it's important to, in words of, in terms of communication, is to pick a community that you think you can relate to, that you think you have something to say to. And that's so critical. So for example, I'm not a member of any organized religion, a person of faith, so to speak. But it's incredibly important to have people of faith communicating to their faith communities. Probably in the climate science world, one of the most famous examples of that is Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, quite an accomplished climate scientist, but also an evangelical Christian. And she has focused lots of her efforts on that community. And she has some credibility with that community. So I think it's important to pick the people that you think you can make progress with. And so just like in living systems are ecosystems, there are categories of organisms that fill different roles within those ecosystems. I think there are ecosystem of communicating. There are categories of people who fill roles in those. And I try not to get in the way of people. Not everybody does it in a way that maybe I agree with, but then they're trying to get through to the communities that they're trying to get through to. So, so I think maybe that's what comes to the top of my head with that question.
Great. I'll throw one more, and then I'm going to open it up to Abby and Caroline to weave some of it in, because they've been following the chat. But and I should actually mention, I think Winona here is on this call. She has started Families for a Livable Climate, and she and her group are bringing I think it's a virtual event, Katharine Hayhoe, who you just mentioned, to speak to Montanans in a similar format to what we have here. And I believe it is April 6th. So keep a lookout from that. Winona, did I get that date right? She said thumbs up.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
So, again, I think we're all trying to learn that, the different voices that we need at different times, and how we can and bring some of that together. So that's exciting for us. We had a couple folks suggest a question prior to the event, thinking about us in Montana, and it's similar to Utah, not exactly the same, but we do have coal, we have oil and gas reserves, and wondering what you could advise, or do you have examples of other smallish communities that that have had an outside effect at either halting fossil fuel extraction, growing the clean energy world. We're really working hard on that, but we have a really unfriendly legislature and a public service commission, public utility commission that is pretty backwards. So any, again, examples or thoughts you have about, we want to have a bigger than average effect, even though we're a little community, on keeping fossil fuels in the ground.
Well, I think that's a great question. I certainly don't claim any expertise here, but I certainly can talk about things I've heard and things that speak to me. And you're absolutely right. This is a place where an area where a place like Montana can punch way above its weight, because you have so much fossil fuel in the ground. If you can have an impact in keeping it in the ground, that is huge, of course, because this is one of the key things that absolutely has to happen. We've got to keep this stuff in the ground. My current thinking on this is that I don't know that I can, off the top of my head, come up with a place that's been successful, really successful in taking large reserves and blocking them off from development. That said, the efforts that I see making real progress on that front are the ones, and here in Utah, the Utah chapter of the Sunrise Movement is making real efforts to speak directly to individual people in the fossil fuel communities where the production happens. So here in Utah, that's places like Carbon County, aptly named, where they mine coal, and places like the Uinta Basin where they're fracking for oil and for natural gas. And these are communities that are heavily dependent on those jobs for their economy. But the people who are there are not disengaged, and they're not stupid. They know that their industry is in trouble, and they're really worried about it. Many of them know that it needs to be phased out, but at the same time, they don't feel like they have options. So I feel like the success that the Sunrise Movement is having here in Utah in opening those conversations is they're forming personal relationships with people in those communities and making it clear to them that their well-being is forefront in our thinking, and that any policy changes that we try to enact to keep it in the ground is need to very much include a plan for how these communities survive that economically, not just survive it, but then thrive in the end. And of course, if you look at the broader picture of the Green New Deal, that's what the Green New Deal is all about. But I've become pretty convinced that that kind of communication can't happen at a Joe Biden level. It has to happen between people on the ground, and the people on the ground have to feel like, yes, they're caring about us. They're actually trying to help us, and they're our partners, not our opponents. That's what that comment brings to mind. And this is like one-on-one, hard, so important work to be done.
Thank you. That's really, I mean, I think that's good food for thought here. I'm going to throw it open to Caroline or Abby. How about Caroline? What's coming up that you want to bring together here?
Sure, lots of good questions in the chat, and I feel like your last points there, Rob, got at one of the questions about what people can do in addition to what's happening at the electoral level for local official or elected officials. There were a lot of different questions started from a comment about BlackRock's recent activity in calling for a price on carbon and concerns about whether or not some of the strategies we've talked about can be successful in a capitalist economy. I know that was something you had talked about in your talk a little bit last year, thinking about these bigger systems of consumption being more of the disease and climate change being a symptom. It seems like people just want you to speak to that a little bit more, if you could. And yeah, sorry, that's not the most articulate question.
No, it's a great question, but what I love about it is it brings in the broader holistic picture. And what I mean by that is, if we actually had a capitalist economy, I think fossils would be dead already. But it's this corporate social welfare economy that we have that is keeping fossils front and center. And so anything, I feel like the approach that again speaks to me, that I see people taking and that I think is effective, with all the caveats that I'm a physicist, yeah, is very much about making this very clear. And of course, as awful as the events in Texas were last week, it is very clear that the fossil death grip on essentially a monopolistic system and a, quote, market system, which of course is a very distorted market system that they have in Texas, is absolutely disastrous. It does not have people's well-being at heart. And so I think, for example, policy-wise, the very big efforts to try to get the subsidies off of fossil fuels, and they happen at so many levels. Being able to write off exploration costs is just one example. But those political efforts to get the subsidies off them so that true costs can actually make their way into the marketplace. Now, I do not think that this is an entirely market solution. In fact, I think it's mostly now a public policy solution. We might have been able to do this through the market if we'd been, really actually doing that for the last 30 years, but it's too late now. So now we've got to take the subsidies off the fossils and get them onto the renewables. The renewables don't even need them to compete, but if we get them on the renewables, that makes them that much more competitive. So I think that's maybe the best answer I have to the capitalism question. I think that there are clearly roles for the market to play in meeting these challenges, but it has to be well regulated, right? And there are things that the market can do and things that it shouldn't. And of course, the role of the government is to sort of I've heard the expression, the invisible hand of the market, which of course is a complete bastardization of the original term. But the role of the government, the role of policy is to pick it up at the elbow and put it over here and say, okay, now do this. Now go ahead and do it. And if we can do that, if we can stack the deck in favor of the industries that we need it to be stacked in favor of, then the market can do really good things. But it's a big role for policy, and in fossil fuels, it's getting the subsidies out of there is like step number one.
What's the next step, right?
What's that?
What's the next step, as you said last year? What's the next step?
What's the next step? And then what's the next step? And then what's the next step? Yeah.
Should we bounce it over to Abby?
Yeah, sure. And I'll do my best again at maybe hopefully getting at some of the thoughtful comments and questions in the chat here with this question. But, I think one of the things that your presentation last year made so clear, Rob, was, and you mentioned this again today, was this idea of these interconnected crises, and really thinking about them as interconnected opens up opportunities for action that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of. And I love that. I think what you said last year was, when you can't solve a problem, sometimes you need to make it bigger. And it feels in a lot of ways like the last year made everything bigger. It seems like, but it does also feel like there, in some ways, there's been a major shift in, cultural narratives and awareness about how racial justice, climate justice, economic justice are all intertwined. Do you see that shift happening in any particularly hopeful ways, or do you have any other thoughts about kind of the nuts and bolts of what it means to think bigger when it comes to some of this stuff? And maybe has COVID opened up any other creative avenues?
Well, there are lots of positive signs. Joe Biden campaigned on a big climate plan. That's never happened in any presidential election, and he won. And he wasn't soft pedaling it. He said, look, it needs to be connected. We need to tie it to wages. We need to tie it to education. We need to tie it to job training, to healthcare, and climate change. All of these things are tied. He's made that very clear in his approach. He's told the federal government that they need to integrate climate change into every policy that is implemented across the federal government. Of doing that, of course, is a matter of leadership and tenacity and all of the hard work. But that is a very positive sign in terms of him seeing, and many high-level policymakers seeing these connections. The one connection that is still not being acknowledged is the connection to growth. And I'm taking that as we're just not quite ready yet. And I think that's true. I think if Joe Biden were to start attacking the notion of economic growth without softening up the beach a lot before the invasion, so to speak, it would be disastrous. So I think my personal opinion is that's the right approach right now. But as far as COVID goes and more positive signs, as I think I said in my earlier remarks, so many things are being laid bare. And even in my world of people who are actively working on climate change very hard to try to get us moving in the right direction, there's been a pretty interesting divide over the last decade over those who say we need to put social justice in there, and in fact at the center of our response, and those scientists and policymakers who say no, it's a distraction and it just makes it harder politically. But what we're finding out now is that just as the proponents of putting social justice at the center have said, it's very clear now that it's not making it politically harder, it's making it politically possible. You know, the fight for climate change right now, I strongly believe, is not about moving the immovable. It's not about convincing the hardcore denier crowd. And let's see, I just want to make sure, am I still with you? You froze on my screen.
We can still hear you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So it's the thinking behind social justice has been, look, this isn't about trying to flip people from denier to all of a sudden activist. Maybe that can happen on the fringes, but that's not where the payoff is. The payoff is in activating people who are not activated. And particularly with COVID, that has caused such an acute economic pain for so many millions of people. You look at the proposal that's now in front of Congress that says, look, we want a $15 minimum wage, and we want serious economic checks for people. We want education training programs. We want healthcare for people. And we want to take all of this positive social power that we have and focus it towards solving these big problems like climate change. You've got a lot of people there who might say to themselves, you know, I don't know much about this climate change thing, but that other stuff sounds good. So using that to act just as a hook to activate people who are unactivated is the first thing. And the second thing is that we can't do the things that we need to do without all hands on deck. And when you've got someone who's about to be evicted, when you've got someone with no health care, when you've got someone who's not making a living wage and has to work 3 jobs, that's not all hands on deck. Those folks aren't going to be working on these issues. They're just trying to survive. And so we've made huge progress, I think, in recognizing the connection of the social justice and the ecological crises, the social crises and the ecological crises. And those people in my profession who, you know, a few years ago, even last year, were poo-pooing the role of social justice are now recognizing that it's absolutely critical. So I think that's been a huge move forward, and I'm pretty excited about that.
You know, I feel like this is maybe a good place to pivot, and then Rob, I know we're gonna bring you back around it here in the end for a minute. You know, we could probably talk for hours, but we wouldn't do that to you on Zoom at this hour of the day. But
it wouldn't be you doing it to me. It would be me doing it to you.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll figure out how to keep talking to you. But you know, I think it's been interesting to see our community really grow and change, and in sometimes beautiful and sometimes painful ways as we've tried to, you know, move through this last year of the pandemic and COVID inequities. I'm going to turn it over to Abby, who wanted to share a few ideas about, it kind of came from what we talked about at the end of your last talk, Rob, about ACT, advocating, assist, doing the different things we need to do. I'm going to let Abby share a couple ideas. And then just so folks on the phone know, we'll wrap up a couple things, and Rob will come back and say a few words. And then I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear from Gwen Langford, who again, she opened our big event at the Wilma a year ago and has some thoughts for the end. And, you know, I guess in all of this, I hope that this is an ongoing, continuing conversation. We're going to hopefully keep in touch with you, Rob, over the time. So, Abby, do you want to jump in quick?
Sure, and it can be brief too. Just, you know, I think it's always helpful to after conversations like this to maybe have like a little bit of a framework to start thinking about many of us are not at a starting point, but to continue thinking about how we can get engaged and continue taking action. And like Rob said, do all that we can, you know, where we are in our position at the moment. And one of the kind of ways that we've thought about that, you know, in our work at Climate Smart, and, you know, that we kind of, that we invite you all to maybe think of as well, to consider how you might get more involved in taking action. We've thought about it kind of in terms of act, advocate, and assist. And there's probably lots of ways to organize your brain around it, but acting in our mind is like all the things that we can do as individuals to reduce our own footprint, you know, get involved in local resiliency efforts, making connections. These are all, you know, these aren't gonna solve the problem all along. We do strongly. And it's important then to advocate, and the legislature is happening right now. We're glad it only happens once every 2 years, but there's a lot that, you know, that citizen advocacy can do at the state level. And regardless of whether it changes any outcomes, our elected officials need to hear from us. And that we can all keep doing at all levels. Is just continue to speak out. Don't ever assume that the fate of something is our voice. And so, not necessarily for these bills, but you know, writing op-eds.
I think, do we lose that? Did we lose Abby? I'm having a hard time hearing you, Abby. Are you still there?
I've lost her.
Yeah, Abby, I think you've been coming in and out and it's kind of deteriorating.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Wait.
I'm here.
Okay. I know, I think you had maybe,
Thanks,
yeah.
sorry, it
Go
was,
ahead.
cutting in and out.
Yeah, Abby, you're frozen and we are getting like
yeah,
one every 10 words.
So anyway, advocate and then assist. Okay.
Yeah, oh, sorry about this, folks. I think maybe we're gonna let Abby hold tight for a minute. Abby, that was just not working for us after a while. I think it might seem like it is, but we weren't hearing you.
No worries.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you know, again, I think I can sum up a little bit because it was, yeah, we all need to act, we all need to advocate. And then the assist we came out because sometimes people don't know what to do and there are ways to donate money, spend time. One of the things that we at Climate Smart are kind of excited about is a new footprint fund offset. It's a carbon offset program, but it's local. And what's unique about it is if people don't, you know, put money in, we are helping to weatherize low-income homes with the Human Resource Council, some really tangible projects. And, you know, that's just us at Climate Smart. We've got a number of great partners out there that are looking, seem to be stepping up and doing more and more, even when it's also been a little bit quiet over the year. I mentioned Winona and Families for a Livable Climate with some of the conversations they're bringing to the community to get more people talking about climate. And I remember, Rob, that was something that you said very well and spoke to last year, was how we can't solve a problem if we don't talk about it, and we need to find creative ways to speak of it. So, you know, we've got some frames that we're trying to work forward. We're trying to integrate those into other community efforts as best we can, and then reach beyond the borders of Missoula, which is always healthy and interesting and sometimes challenging. So I'm gonna, we are kind of running up on the hour, but I wanted to pass that to Caroline, and then, you know, Rob, we'll be back with you for a second, and then we'll, hopefully, Gwen, you can stay just a few minutes past 6. I know you've got some kiddos there, but we do want to hear from you. So, Caroline? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Just, you want to go over some of the art stuff, Amy?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. If anyone, I know there's been a lot in the chat about the energy consumption of having our video on during Zoom, but if you want to turn it on briefly, if you have been doodling at all, Rob, I took your idea of, you're not really gonna be able to see it, but putting the name of the meeting in the middle and then drawing from there. And had a lot of fun doing it. So we'd love to collect any doodles that you all made. And you can send them to Caroline at Climate Smart Missoula or Amy at Climate Smart Missoula, and we'll compile them and make something fun out of it. And yeah, we just encourage you to keep working on bringing in that art into our climate earth work. As we say, you can't have earth without art. So we'd love to see what you all come up with. And then I guess I'll pass it to Gwen unless someone does want to hold up their whatever they doodled on in the last hour.
I think we'll pass it back to Rob first.
Oh, sorry.
And then we'll hit you, Gwen. So yeah, Rob, just again, this was just an opportunity. If from these questions, however you wanted to bring things together a bit.
I'll be very brief, and I'm also anxious to see to hear what Gwen has to say. I think what I'd like to just conclude with is this one thought in this notion of communication and how do we pick something to move forward. I truly believe at this point that much of the work that's to be done is at a personal level. And I mentioned this notion of so many of our neighbors now, our family members, our friends, our neighbors working in this world of just utterly detached from reality. And I don't know how to quote deprogram people, but I think if it's going to happen on this one-on-one level. And if it's possible to bring someone back into the fold, it's got to be done. If it's not, we have to step around them, not step on them. I just think it's so critical that in our engagements now, we simply cannot be noise with others in our communities, with policymakers on social media. We cannot be noise. We have to be signal. And that means compassion. That means not, even though it can feel good in the moment, and I'm with you on to get that zinger in and to get that thing in. If it's not constructive, if it's not going to bring someone into the fold, if it's not going to communicate something that needs to be communicated, then it's noise. And we don't have time to be noise. We have to be signal. So I think maybe I would just end with that, is in your communications, in all of our interactions with people, let's treat them like our neighbors and with as much compassion as possible, and try to be as constructive as possible in our actions. And I think the times really call for that. Thanks again for the invitation, Amy and Caroline, and I'm interested to hear Gwen.
Thank you, Gwen. It's all you.
Hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Davies, and thank you, Amy, Caroline, and Abby, Mason. I really appreciate the work that you guys have done to make this event come to fruition. I really appreciated last year the opportunity to be a part of the event and to hear your wisdom, Dr. Davies. It was really moving, and I know in our community there was quite a bit of buzz around your presentation for quite a while. So I know it had an impact, and I know it was definitely something people could feel. I appreciate being here tonight. And I guess the first thing that I think when everyone keeps on saying they can't wait to hear from me is, so much of what I guess I'm trying to do. And I think what I guess I want to say is just that, what I'm taught from my elders and from my community is hopefully what I'm reflecting back. And I guess I just want to say I come tonight in that sense of humility and hopefully with a sense of modesty as well. And I say that because the picture that keeps on coming to my mind, and in fact, what I drew in my little doodle might not seem like much, is these two things. When we're talking about the climate issue, the picture that comes to my mind is such a vertical integration. There's this concentration at the top of dominion. There's a concentration of power. There's a concentration of resources. And it's been referenced in so many different ways tonight through statistics of who's on the bottom, who is in absolute dire straits in terms of having their needs met. But then also the picture again of how things are being driven because of that vertical integration. And I guess one of the things that I know that I've been taught, and the picture that just keeps on coming to my mind again and again as I've been listening, is something that's more of a horizontal integration. And it's something that's it's very much a part of Indigenous culture and Indigenous value systems as well. And the picture that I always give is that we could think of ourselves all as being a part of a circle, and we're all points on the circle. And what's so deeply important is that each of us recognizes our own sovereign gifts and our own sovereign authority and our sovereign abilities. You know, there's a note that I wrote down as well. There's something for everyone to do in the middle of this crisis. And, you know, backing up even more, part of recognizing, I guess, that sovereign ability that you have is also part of what you're gifted when Creator brings you into this world. You know, part of the communion of you getting breath and coming to life in these bodies is also this ability that is planted in you, this sovereign kind of authority that you have. And part of being in that circle is recognizing what your gifts are and then offering them into the circle, because that's how the circle stays strong. But in fact, even maybe more critically, what's also important is as you step into the circle and you offer your gifts, one of the most important things, and this is so fundamental again to a value system that I think we need to really deeply embrace, is there's a covenant of reciprocity. That ethic of reciprocity means that not only am I coming into the circle and I'm offering my gifts, but I also see that you have gifts, and I hear that you have gifts, and I recognize that not only am I part of that circle and I'm offering my sovereign ability, but also everyone else's as well. And so much I think of the pain and the suffering that we experience, especially in a vertical system, is that we can't see each other. It's also deeply transactional. And transactions are not relationships. When you're in a vertical situation, you can't see, the top can't see the bottom can't see the top. Maybe you can't even see who's stepping on top of you. But when you're in a horizontal integration and there's an ethic of reciprocity and knowing that what I have to offer is valued, I'm being seen and I'm being heard. And I recognize that I also see and I hear and I recognize and I value and I support what you bring into the circle as well. Then it makes the circle so much stronger. And it also is part of the issue as well. When there's parts of the circle that aren't as strong, again, when you're part of that circle, the parts that are strong in that moment can always step in and hold the circle. And again, just being part of that is so important. And I think, again, you know, one of the things that Dr. Davies referenced too is just the nature of relationships and how really fundamentally that's the future. And I think, again, that picture of a horizontal integration and a recognition that we all have value to bring in this, and that need as humans to be seen and heard, is so critical. And again, another part to it that's really important is that circle doesn't include just people. It doesn't include just humans. That circle also includes our relatives, the animals. It includes the water. It includes the air. That ethic of reciprocity and recognizing, again, that we can't exist without each other. We can't exist without the water. We can't exist without the land. We can't exist without the animals. And again, in that circle, if any part of that circle is ever compromised or it's sick and it's not held in a way and it's not supported in a way, then it actually puts at risk the entire community. And so again, that ethic of reciprocity is just so critical, and it's really about the future. And it starts with each of us as individuals in having that sense of who we are and that sense in knowing that sense of divinity that we have in us by virtue even of just me having breath and knowing that that is such a sign of divinity. It's a sign of me being able to live and to being able to operate in the world. And even with people that I don't like sometimes, I need to remember that there's some reason that they're here. And by virtue of them having that breath, that communion of their spirit and their body, that there is a reason for them, and they are also part of the circle. And so we all need to have boundaries, absolutely, and that you can't eat everything that's given to you sometimes, because sometimes it's not good for you. But we also need to give people dignity. And I think, again, when you're in a horizontal situation and you're in a transactional value system, it's really difficult to allow people to have that dignity and to allow them to express their true divinity and their sovereign ability. So I guess the biggest thing that just again keeps on coming to mind is that covenant of reciprocity and how important that is, just to see each other, to hear each other, and also to really hone and to recognize your own gifts and to offer them when you can. And I just appreciate all the work that everyone's doing. And I would say that more than anything, in those circles and in our circle that we have here, we need leaders and we need visionaries, and that may be part of your gift. And I would say that all the people that are on this call tonight, in some ways, are really truly visionary, because we understand that there is a crisis that we're dealing with. And we know, and we may not have our finger exactly on the pulse of what the next step is, but we have a sense that there has to be some visionary and some bold thinking. And so that's your sovereign gift that you bring forward. And I'm just so grateful for all of you to be a part of this. And I'm just so privileged and honored to be, asked to even be speaking in this company, because it's really a company that I have such deep reverence and respect for. So thank you so much. And thank you. And my daughter here is again, one more time, Cecilia is here listening. And I don't know if you have anything to say or offer, but.
No, just thank you, Dr. Davies.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's
Those were wonderful words.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gwen, we so appreciate you you offering this perspectives. I think it's a nice way to wind this down. I know we weren't able to answer everyone's questions. I think it's a lot of food for thought. We do have this recorded. We can even save the chat if folks want to know some of what the conversation was out there and weren't able to follow it. But with that, unless Rob, you have any kind of closing thoughts, we'll let you get on with your evening.
I think Gwen's words are a wonderful place to leave it.
Great. Okay. Thanks everyone. I hope this is one of many conversations we can have together. And we all, I know at Climate Smart, look forward to potentially, hopefully having them in person one of these days coming forward. I think that will feel good. I think we all need it. Zoom is only going so far, but it was great to have all of you there, and we're grateful for this community. So with that, we'll let folks get on with their evening.
Thank you, Amy, for organizing this, and thanks for coming, Rob.
Amy, I'll go ahead and save the chat in just a minute so we have all of that preserved.
Here's my picture.
Oh, nice.
Oh, somebody's got a picture? That's great. I also saved that, and then I just hit the recording off, so we should have that saved too. So great. Again, Rob, thank you so much.
Thanks a bunch, Amy. Did you say that have you saved a text version of the chat?
We did, yeah.
I'd love to see it and just be able to scroll
yeah,
through it.
I wasn't following it too carefully. I know Caroline and Abby were working on it.
This is how I'm doing classes, and I've got chat, and it's super hard to monitor the chat.
Yeah, I really am really challenged with it.
It's a whole thing. So
okay.
much empathy from me.
Yeah. Hey, Rob, this is a specific question. If you have one more minute, one of our council members was wondering, have you been following that the HB 411 conversation there was the bill that was passed where the municipalities and cities are trying to work with Rocky Mountain Power to get different clean energy. Is that anything that you've been really intimately involved in? No, but I have good friends who are. Mm-hmm. And I don't actually know where it's at right now. Okay. Somebody texted me to ask that, didn't want it to get lost in the chat. And I think from our conversation a year ago, it wasn't something you were deeply involved in, but I thought I'd ask anyway. So are you familiar with Utah Clean Energy, Amy? Yeah, those are the folks, right? Yeah, Josh and Sarah are tracking it very closely and working. I mean, they're just working around the clock right now. Of course, the legislature's in session, so. Okay, yeah, I've met Sarah and possibly Josh, I can't remember. Yeah, I've met them before, so okay, great. Yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna end the meeting and we will be in touch. And again, thank you so much. Thanks again, Amy. Bye, okay. Caroline.
Thanks, Rob.
Take care.